There's a specific kind of stubbornness born from total exhaustion. When I pulled into my remote campsite and found another guy pitching his tent on my dirt pad, the mature thing would have been to leave. I didn't. He didn't. We just stared each other down. That's how it started. I didn't believe in fate. I believed in bureaucratic incompetence. It was mid-October, the kind of biting, damp autumn that sinks right into your joints. I had spent the last 6 months watching my life disassemble itself. My long-term relationship had ended in a quiet, suffocating fizzle, and my job as a structural engineer felt like staring at the same gray wall for 10 hours a day. I needed out. I needed silence. I needed to not look at another human face, which was exactly why I booked Site 14 at Blackwood. Wait, no, let's call it Oak Haven State Park. It was situated at the end of a heavily rutted dirt road, 40 miles from the nearest cell tower. It was the most isolated spot on the map. My shocks groaned as I navigated the final bend, the headlights of my truck cutting through the gathering dusk. The relief washing over me was physical. I just wanted to turn the engine off, crack a beer, and listen to nothing. Then I saw the dark gray Tacoma. It was parked dead center on the gravel pad of Site 14. A guy was out back, wrestling with the rain fly of a heavy canvas tent. He was tall, wearing a faded flannel shirt and work boots, with dark hair curling damply against the nape of his neck. I put my truck in park. I didn't turn off the engine. I just sat there, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, letting the exhaustion curdle into hot, irrational anger. I stepped out of the truck and slammed the door. The sound echoed off the dense wall of pine trees. The guy looked up. He didn't look startled. He just looked tired. "You're in my spot," I said. No greeting, no polite throat clearing. He paused, a tent stake in one hand and a rubber mallet in the other. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist. "Pretty sure I'm in my spot, Site 14. I booked Site 14 6 months ago." I marched over to the wooden post marking the site, as if the carved numbers would somehow arbitrate this dispute. He dropped the mallet. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. He walked over to his truck, reached through the open window, and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to me. It was a printed confirmation from the state park website. Site 14, October 12th through 16th, paid in full. Name, Leo. I dug into my own jacket pocket and pulled out my folded confirmation. I shoved it toward him. Site 14, October 12th through 16th, paid in full. Name, Ian. We stood there in the fading light, 2 printed sheets of paper fluttering slightly in the cold wind. "The system double booked us," Leo said. His voice was a low baritone, completely devoid of the panic or apology I wanted him to feel. Clearly, I grabbed my paper back. "The ranger station is 40 miles back. They closed at 5. I know. So, one of us has to leave." Leo looked at my truck. Then he looked at his half-pitched tent. He looked back at me, his jaw setting into a hard line. "I've been driving for 9 hours. I just hammered in 8 stakes in rocky soil. I'm not leaving." "I've been driving for 11, I shot back, the lie coming easily. I was running on 4 hours of sleep and a diet of gas station coffee. And I booked this because I need to be alone." "Then we have a problem," Leo said, "because I'm not packing up." I glared at him. He glared back. It was a ridiculous standoff. 2 grown men acting like territorial feral cats over a patch of dirt and pine needles. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to just get in the truck, drive to a motel, and deal with the rangers in the morning. But the rational part of my brain had been overridden by a deep, hollow fatigue. I was drawing a line in the sand. "Fine," I snapped. I pivoted on my heel and marched to the back of my truck. I dropped the tailgate with a loud metallic crash. I grabbed my duffel bag and my tent. "What are you doing?" Leo asked, watching me march to the far left corner of the site, a good 30 feet from his setup. "Setting up camp," I said, dropping my gear onto a relatively flat patch of ground. "It's a big site. Stay on your side of the fire ring, I'll stay on mine." Leo watched me for a long moment. He shook his head, picked up his rubber mallet, and went back to work. For the next hour, the only sounds were the aggressive rustling of nylon, the pounding of tent stakes, and the wind picking up through the canopy. We operated in a hostile, heavy silence. I aggressively unrolled my sleeping bag. He aggressively chopped a piece of firewood. We were a parody of rugged masculinity, both of us refusing to yield an inch. By the time the sun fully dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. Oakhaven had strict fire regulations. There was only one heavy iron fire ring in the center of the site. I sat on my camping chair in the dark, wrapped in a down jacket, stubbornly eating cold trail mix. Across the site, I heard the strike of a match. A small flame flickered, then caught. Leo had built a fire. The orange light danced across his face, highlighting a strong jaw and exhausted eyes. He sat back in his chair, staring into the flames. The heat radiated outward, stopping just short of where I sat, shivering. I chewed my almonds out of sheer spite. I was going to freeze to death to prove a point. 10 minutes passed. "Are you going to sit in the dark like a serial killer all night?" Leo's voice drifted across the dirt pad. I stopped chewing. "There's room," he added, not looking at me. Pride is a funny thing. It keeps you warm right up until the moment hypothermia sets in. I grabbed my chair, dragged it across the gravel, and set it down exactly opposite him, the fire ring acting as a heavily fortified border between us. The fire cracked, spitting a shower of bright orange sparks into the black air. We sat in silence for 20 minutes. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the kind of heavy, loaded quiet that demands someone break it, but neither of us was willing to be the first to crack. I studied him through the smoke. Up close, Leo looked older than I had first thought. Late 30s, maybe. He had lines around his eyes that suggested he spent a lot of time squinting into the sun, or maybe just worrying. His hands, resting on his knees, were rough and calloused. He was drinking a dark stout out of a can. "I'm Ian," I said finally. The words felt like sandpaper in my throat. He took a slow sip of his beer. "Leo, are you always this stubborn, Leo? Or is it a special occasion?" A dry, huffing laugh escaped his nose. "I could ask you the same thing, Ian. You looked ready to run me over with your truck." It crossed my mind. He reached into a cooler beside him, pulled out a second can, and tossed it to me. I caught it reflexively. It was ice cold. I cracked it open. The sharp, bitter taste of the stout grounded me a little. "I needed the quiet," Leo said, his voice dropping a register. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking into the core of the fire. "Things got loud back home. Head loud." I knew exactly what he meant. I felt that exact same loud. The buzzing, relentless pressure of expectations, of failures, of a life that looked fine on paper, but felt entirely hollow inside. I didn't say any of that. I just took another drink. Yeah, me too, I said. We didn't speak again that night, but the hostility had burned off, leaving a strange, cautious neutrality in its wake. When the fire died down to glowing red embers, we both stood, gave a curt nod, and retreated to our respective tents. I woke up to the sound of rain. Not a drizzle, but a steady drumming downpour that battered the thin nylon of my tent. The cold had seeped through my sleeping bag. I laid there for an hour, watching my breath plume in the damp air, dreading the moment I had to unzip the door. When I finally emerged, the campsite was a muddy mess. The fire pit was a puddle of gray sludge. Leo was already up. He had strung a large green tarp between 3 pines, creating a dry canopy over the picnic table. He was sitting underneath it, nursing an enamel mug of coffee, watching a small camp stove hiss. He saw me standing in the rain, looking pathetic. He didn't gloat, he just gestured to the empty space under the tarp. "Water's hot," he said. I ducked under the shelter. The smell of fresh coffee hit me, rich and dark. He poured boiling water into my French press without asking. We sat at opposite ends of the damp wooden table, watching the rain hammer the forest floor. "Supposed to let up by noon," he noted, checking his watch. "Good. I plan on hiking up to the ridge. Being stuck here is going to drive me insane. Ridge trail is steep, muddy today." "I have boots," I replied defensively. Leo just shrugged and went back to his coffee. By noon, the rain had indeed tapered off into a fine mist. The forest smelled intensely of wet pine needles and ozone. I packed a small day bag, laced up my boots, and headed for the trailhead at the back of the campground. I walked for an hour, my muscles burning as the incline increased. The physical exertion was exactly what I needed. It forced the noise out of my head. I was just focusing on placing one foot in front of the other, navigating slick roots and jagged rocks. I rounded a sharp switchback and stopped dead. Sitting on a fallen cedar, drinking from a Nalgene bottle, was Leo. He looked up. We stared at each other. "You have got to be kidding me," I said, letting out a breathless, exasperated laugh. "There are 50 miles of trails in this park." "It's a popular ridge," Leo deadpanned, screwing the cap back on his water bottle. "I thought the whole point of this weekend was to avoid people." "It is. You just happen to be very bad at avoiding me." I couldn't help it. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd felt form on my face in months. It felt strange, foreign. Leo saw it, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward in response. Before either of us could say anything else, the sky cracked open. It wasn't a gradual return of the rain. It was a sudden, violent deluge. The canopy above us offered zero protection. Within seconds, my jacket was soaked through. "Over here!" Leo shouted over the roar of the rain. He grabbed his bag and scrambled up a steep embankment. I followed him, slipping on the slick mud, grabbing onto wet ferns to haul myself up. He disappeared behind a massive granite boulder. I rounded the rock and found him tucked into a shallow, cave-like overhang. It wasn't deep, maybe 5 feet, but it was dry. I shoved myself in beside him. The space was incredibly tight. We were sitting shoulder to shoulder, our knees pulled up to our chests to keep out of the cascading water. I was shivering violently. My thin rain jacket was completely useless against the sudden drop in temperature. Leo looked at me. His face was inches from mine. I could see the individual drops of water clinging to his eyelashes. I could smell the damp wool of his sweater, mixed with the scent of pine and something distinctly him, a warm, earthy musk. "You're freezing," he said, his voice quiet, barely audible over the rain. "I'm fine," I lied through chattering teeth. He didn't argue. He just unzipped his heavy canvas jacket, draped half of it over my shivering shoulders, and pulled me tight against his side. I froze. Not from the cold, but from the sudden, shocking heat of his body. Every muscle in my back went rigid. I hadn't been touched, really touched, in over half a year. The weight of his arm around me, the solid wall of his chest against my side, it short-circuited my brain. "Just trying to prevent hypothermia, Ian," he murmured, his breath warm against my temple. "Don't overthink it." I slowly let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I let myself lean into him. "I never overthink anything," I whispered back. He chuckled, a deep vibration I felt against my ribs. And as the rain tore through the forest outside our little stone shelter, the heavy, cynical armor I had been wearing for months quietly began to crack. The storm raged for another hour. We stayed wedged in that granite crevice, listening to the water completely wash away the trail we had just climbed. The initial shock of Leo's body heat slowly transitioned into a dull, achy comfort. I stopped shivering. My breathing leveled out, matching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. The roaring deluge outside filled the silence perfectly. When the rain finally dialed back to a miserable, spitting drizzle, we unwedged ourselves. My legs were stiff, my jeans soaked up to the knees. Leo handed me back my damp jacket, his eyes catching mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "We should get back," he said, his voice a low rasp from the cold. "Trail is going to be a slip and slide." He wasn't wrong. The descent took twice as long. We navigated washed-out switchbacks and treacherous root systems. Several times my boots lost purchase on the slick mud. Every time I slipped, Leo was there. A firm grip on my shoulder, a hand gripping my forearm. It wasn't romantic. It was practical. But every point of contact felt like a static shock, a jarring reminder of the living, breathing man right beside me. We reached the campsite just as the heavy gray sky began to darken into night. The gravel pad was a disaster area. I walked over to my side of the site and stopped. My stomach dropped. I had pitched my tent in a slight depression. During the dry evening before, it looked like a perfectly flat, soft spot of dirt. Now it was a 2-inch deep puddle. Water had seeped under the rainfly, overwhelming the thin nylon floor. I unzipped the flap. My sleeping bag was a dark, heavy mass of wet synthetic down. My spare clothes in the duffel were soaked. It was a total loss. I stood there, staring into the ruined nylon dome, the exhaustion I had been fighting off for months hitting me like a physical blow. I didn't have the energy to be angry. I just felt incredibly, heavily empty. I heard boots crunching on the wet gravel behind me. Leo stood a few feet away, taking in the scene. "Well," I said, my voice flat. "That's that, I guess. I'll pack it into the truck and sleep in the cab." "You drive a standard cab," Leo noted. "You're 6'2". You won't sleep. You'll just cramp up and freeze." "I'll run the heater. You have a 1/4 tank of gas. I saw your gauge when you left your door open yesterday." He didn't say it to be a jerk. He was just stating facts. He pointed across the fire ring to his massive heavy-duty canvas setup. "My tent is an 8-person expedition model. I have an elevated cot. There's a dry foam pad on the floor. It's yours. I'm not kicking you out of your tent, Leo. I'm not offering to leave," he replied evenly. I'm on the cot. You're on the floor. We're both adults. We can manage 10 feet of floor space without killing each other. My cynical brain searched for a reason to say no, purely out of residual spite. But the wind picked up, cutting through my wet clothes, and my teeth started to chatter again. Pride is expensive. I couldn't afford it anymore. Fine, I muttered. Thank you. We spent the next 30 minutes dragging my soaked gear into the bed of my truck, tossing a tarp over the mess. By the time we finished, it was pitch black. Leo got the fire going again, using dry wood he had stashed under his truck. He didn't make a big deal out of the shifted dynamic. He pulled a cast iron skillet out of his camp box, chopped up some peppers, onions, and smoked sausage, and threw it over the grates. The smell was intoxicating. I sat in my chair, huddled near the flames, watching his hands work. They were capable hands. Sure, steady. He handed me a tin plate piled high with food. I ate it like I hadn't seen a meal in a week. He watched me from across the fire, a faint, amused smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Slow down, he said, opening a bottle of cheap rye whiskey and pouring 2 fingers into a pair of tin cups. You'll choke. I've been living on protein bars and Spite for 2 days, I said, around a mouthful of sausage. He handed me a cup. I took a sip. The whiskey burned a hot, welcome trail down my throat. So, Leo said, leaning back and resting his boots near the fire ring. What exactly were you running away from? It was a blunt question. Yesterday, I would have told him to go to hell. Tonight, with a belly full of hot food and the whiskey loosening the tight knot in my chest, I just sighed. A dead-end relationship, I said, staring at the embers. 7 years, we just stopped looking at each other, stopped talking. By the end, we were just 2 ghosts haunting the same apartment. When it finally ended, I thought I'd feel relieved. I just felt like a failure, like I wasted my 30s building a house on a sinkhole. Leo nodded slowly. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. I appreciated the hell out of him for that. What about you? I asked. Paramedic, he said quietly. Chicago. I spent the last 3 years scraping people off the pavement, watching families fall apart in emergency rooms. You see enough of that, you start vibrating. It gets in your bones. The sirens, the monitors, the screaming. A few weeks ago, I was sitting in my rig, and my hands started shaking. Just wouldn't stop. He took a long swallow of his whiskey. I took an indefinite leave, packed the truck, drove until the radio stations turned to static. I just needed everything to shut up. We sat in the heavy, smoky silence. It wasn't a standoff anymore. It was an armistice. 2 burned-out men, sitting in the mud, drinking cheap whiskey, holding space for the wreckage of each other's lives. Sleeping in the same tent was less awkward than I anticipated, mostly because I crashed the second my head hit the makeshift pillow. The thick canvas blocked the wind entirely, trapping our body heat inside. I woke up just before dawn. The air in the tent was freezing, but I was warm under my dry blankets. I rolled onto my back. Above me, on the cot, Leo was already awake. He was lying on his side, his arm tucked under his head, watching me. The dim blue light filtering through the canvas gave his face a soft, bruised quality. He didn't look away when I caught him staring. He just kept looking at me, his dark eyes unreadable. Morning, he rasped, his voice thick with sleep. Mornin'. I swallowed hard. The air suddenly felt very thin. We got up. We made coffee. The hostility of the first day was completely gone, replaced by a strange, magnetic pull. I found myself tracking his movements around the campsite. I noticed the way his flannel pulled tight across his shoulders when he swung the axe. I noticed the small, jagged scar just below his jawline. We didn't hike that day. We didn't do much of anything. We sat by the fire, reading battered paperbacks. We talked. We didn't talk about trauma or breakups anymore. We talked about stupid things, bad movies, the worst meals we'd ever eaten. I made him laugh. A real, chest-deep laugh that completely transformed his face, making him look 5 years younger. By late afternoon, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long golden rays through the pine trees. We were sitting side by side on the picnic table, our shoulders brushing. "Tomorrow's the 16th, Leo said quietly, looking out at the tree line. Yeah. My chest tightened. The real world was waiting. The emails, the empty apartment, the gray walls of my office. "I don't want to pack up," he said. "Me neither." He turned his head. We were inches apart. The joking, the casual banter, it all completely evaporated. He looked at my mouth, then up to my eyes. The question was there, hanging heavy in the cool autumn air. I didn't think about it. If I thought about it, I would have ruined it. I just leaned in and closed the distance. The kiss was clumsy at first, a collision of rough stubble and dry lips. But then his hand came up, calloused fingers gripping the back of my neck, grounding me, pulling me in closer. The hesitation vanished. I grabbed the heavy wool of his sweater, pulling him against me. It was a desperate, hungry kiss. It tasted like coffee and wood smoke, and the sharp, undeniable relief of finally finding something real in a world of ghosts. When we finally pulled back, we were both breathing hard. I kept my forehead pressed against his. "Well," I whispered, "that complicates the checkout process." Leo let out a breathy laugh, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "Yeah, it does." That night, we didn't bother with the foam pad on the floor. We crammed onto the narrow cot. It was incredibly uncomfortable. My shoulder jammed against the metal frame, his arm wrapped tight around my chest to keep us from rolling off. I had never slept better in my entire life. The next morning was brutal. Packing up camp is always depressing, but this felt like dismantling a lifeboat. We broke down the canvas tent in silence. We loaded his truck, then mine. When there was nothing left on Site 14 but a cold fire ring and a patch of flattened dirt, we stood between our vehicles. The silence was back, but it wasn't the hostile silence of the first day. It was the terrified silence of two men waiting to see if the other was going to walk away. Leo pulled a small notebook out of his dashboard. He scribbled something down, tore the page out, and handed it to me. It was a phone number. "I'm in Chicago," he said, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You're in Milwaukee. It's a 90-minute drive." I looked at the crumpled piece of paper. Then I looked at the man standing in front of me. The exhaustion that had been crushing my chest for 6 months was gone. "I get off work at 5 on Fridays," I said, meeting his eyes. "Traffic on 94 is hell. But I can make it to your place by 7. The hard lines around Leo's eyes melted. He took a step forward, grabbed me by the jacket, and kissed me hard against the side of my truck. "Drive safe, Ian." "You too, Leo." I got into my truck and turned the key. The engine roared to life. I watched in the rearview mirror as Leo climbed into his Tacoma. We pulled out of Site 14, 2 trucks kicking up dust on a deeply rutted road, heading back to a world that suddenly looked a hell of a lot brighter. Sometimes the best things happen when your plans completely fall apart. If Ian and Leo's story resonated with you, drop a comment below. Have you ever found exactly what you needed when you weren't looking? Hit that like button, share this video with someone who gets it, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. We have a lot more real, grounded stories coming your way very soon. Turn on those notifications so you don't miss out. See you then.